The waxworks were never meant to move. That was their unspoken covenant with the paying public of London. They might leer, they might startle, they might be poised in attitudes of terror or ecstasy, but their glassy eyes would remain forever fixed, their painted lips forever closed, and their silence would endure as long as the gas lamps burned above them. On the evening when the affair of the Wax Museum began, the great exhibition hall in Holborn was thronged with all ranks of society, drawn like moths to the novelty of a new chamber of figures, where the most notorious criminals of recent years had been preserved in wax with a fidelity that was already the gossip of the clubs and music halls. Beneath a ceiling, hung with crystal and gilt, beneath tiers of balconies crowded with murmuring spectators, rows of unmoving faces stared back at the curious and the indolent, each one arrested in the moment of some remembered infamy. Holmes stood a little apart from the crush, his tall figure outlined by the glow of a nearby bracket lamp, his keen, deep-set eyes traveling not over the waxen rogues that had been advertised so heavily in the evening papers, but over the crowd that had come to see them. At his side, Watson watched the shifting tide of top hats and feathers, of uniforms and sober frock coats, conscious, as he often was in his friend's presence, that the world contained an undercurrent of meaning which his own eyes could not wholly read. Nearby, Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard was exchanging perfunctory compliments with Madame Varenne, the proprietress of the establishment, whose pale, clever face and dark gown gave her the appearance of a figure who might herself have stepped out of one of the glass cases. There was laughter somewhere above, as a party of young men pretended to be alarmed by the effigy of a hanged murderer. There was the faint scrape of a bow as a small orchestra in an alcove struck up a waltz. There was the hiss of gas through jets and the soft shuffle of feet upon the polished floor. If the reader could have stood there with them in that press of London society, smelling the mingled perfumes and damp wool, hearing the subdued exclamations as each familiar criminal was recognized and pointed out, they might have felt as Holmes did a curious dissonance between the gaiety of the scene and the cold, watchful faces that surrounded it. The Times had carried, that morning, a column upon the moral influence of such exhibitions, debating whether it was wholesome to preserve infamous men and women in wax for the amusement of the public. It had been this article which led Lestrade, who was no great reader of the more reflective sections of the press, to remark to Holmes that he would be in attendance at the opening, and to mutter that there were complications about the place which he could not yet put into words. It was also, as Holmes had observed with a touch of irony, an excellent way of ensuring that the Yard's presence would be remarked by the highest circles. As for those who delight in hearing of Holmes's more singular cases, and who now sit in their own fashion as spectators before the shifting panorama of his adventures, they may find some profit in accompanying us through this evening from its first glitter to its last somber reflection. If such readers would remain with these pages, as the better sort of audience remains to the fall of the final curtain, they shall see how a trifle observed among these waxen effigies led in due course to the uncovering of secrets that had lain buried, not only beneath the floor of the museum, but in the hearts of living men. For what followed could not have been guessed from those first moments, when the only movement among the figures was the play of lamplight across features that should have been lifeless. The figure that should not have been there. It was upon a raw evening in late autumn that Holmes and Watson found themselves, by invitation of Lestrade and the proprietress, among the throng that had gathered for the opening of Varenne's grand museum of wax figures in Holborn. The rain of the day had left the pavement slick and the air heavy with that peculiar mixture of coal smoke and damp that clings to London like a second skin. Cloaks were shaken in the vestibule, umbrellas handed to liveried attendants under the direction of a nervous manager, and there was a murmur of anticipation as each new arrival passed beneath the glass doors into the main hall, where the gas lamps burned with a steady, golden flame. The orchestra, in its alcove, was attempting a waltz that could not quite be heard above the hum of voices, and from the far end of the hall there came, from time to time, a ripple of laughter as some novelty or other was first spied and pointed out. Watson, standing with his back to a fluted column, allowed his gaze to travel over the great room. He noted, as was his habit, the variety of faces, the ruddy cheeks and bristling mustaches of city men whose overcoats still smelt faintly of the counting-house, the pale, eager profiles of clerks and shop-girls who had saved from their modest wages to purchase a ticket to this latest marvel, the impassive countenance of a colonel retired from India, whose medals glinted beneath his starched shirt front, and, here and there, the sharp, bird-like features of those ladies and gentlemen who made it their business to be seen at every new spectacle the town provided. Yet it was not the living that held the attention of most, but the unmoving ranks set behind polished glass or top-raised platforms. Kings and statesmen, actresses in their most famous costumes, explorers in tropical helmets, and, most prominently advertised in the handbills distributed outside, the chamber of figures containing truly life-sized representations of the most notorious malefactors of our century. Holmes, however, appeared singularly indifferent to the waxen, celebrities who drew such exclamations from their admirers. His hands were thrust deep into the pockets of his overcoat, his lean face turned slightly aside as if to catch some sound that the general ear ignored. Watson, who knew every nuance of that hawk-like profile, saw the nostrils dilate almost imperceptibly and the eyelids lower in that half-abstracted manner which indicated that his friend's mind had already leapt ahead of the mere spectacle to some question beyond. When Lestrade, elbowing his way through the crowd with the air of a man performing a disagreeable duty, accosted them with a perfunctory word of greeting, Holmes replied politely enough, but his attention seemed fixed upon a point beyond the inspector's shoulder. "You wished me to see this place, Lestrade," Holmes remarked at last, his voice pitched low so as not to carry to the curious ears nearby. "I infer that your interest is not confined to the artistry of Madame Varenne's waxworkers." Lestrade's narrow face tightened. "You have the right of it, Mr. Holmes," he muttered. "There have been one or two oddities about the establishment. Nothing that I could take to the chief as yet. But when I heard they was opening a chamber of criminals, and when I saw the sort of crowd it would bring, I thought it as well that someone with your eye should be on hand." Holmes's glance swept once more over the hall. "Oddities in the accounts, in the clientele, or in the figures themselves?" Lestrade shifted upon his feet. "You are as bad as ever for jumping ahead, sir. Let us say there has been some talk amongst the constables on this beat and one or two quiet inquiries from quarters that are not usually interested in wax museums. I should prefer you to form your own impressions." Madame Varenne chose that moment to approach, her dark eyes alight with that particular mixture of anxiety and ambition which Watson had often observed in those who placed their fortunes at the mercy of the public's taste. She was not a young woman, but her figure was erect, and there was an air of command in the way she moved her gloved hand to indicate the arrangement of the hall. "Monsieur Holmes, is it not?" she said in lightly accented English. "And Dr. Watson, whose chronicles I have heard of, though I confess I have not yet had the leisure to read them. I am honored that you join us. You find my little collection amusing, I hope." "I find it instructive," Holmes replied, bowing slightly. "Man in the mass is never more revealing than when confronted with an imitation of himself. Observe that gentleman there, Watson. He is more impressed by his own reflection in the glass than by the statesman at his elbow." Madame Varenne's smile tightened at the corners. "You are severe, monsieur. But it is true that people come as much to see themselves among the great as to see the great themselves. That is why I have arranged the hall as you see." She gestured around them. "The public may promenade between history and notoriety, between those who rule and those who defy. It is a true picture of our times." "And the chamber of figures?" Holmes asked, his tone light, though his eyes had sharpened at her remark. "I understand that the criminal classes are segregated, as in life, from the more respectable. But of course," she replied, "we reveal them only when we choose. You will see, monsieur, there will be a little ceremony soon. The orchestra will play, the curtain will lift, and London shall look its own monsters in the face. There was, shortly afterwards, that promised ceremony. The crowd pressed towards the far end of the hall, where a heavy curtain of dark velvet concealed an inner chamber. The orchestra struck up a more solemn air. A short speech was made by a gentleman of the press, in which the pedagogic value of confronting vice in effigy was dwelt upon with some eloquence. Madame Varenne curtsied, a rope was pulled, and the curtain swept aside to reveal a semicircular room beyond, lit by a lower, more concentrated light. Watson felt, as he stepped across the threshold in Holmes's wake, a slight chill, as if the air in this inner sanctum were of a different temperature. The walls were lined with figures, each upon its own plinth, each accompanied by a small printed placard giving the name, crime, and fate of the malefactor represented. Here was a garroter whose trial had filled the papers for weeks. There, a poisoner whose pale face had once peered from the dock, with an expression of injured innocence that had deceived none. The sculptor had done his work with an attention to detail that bordered on the grotesque. The pores of the skin, the folds of the garments, even the veins upon the backs of the hands, had been rendered with a fidelity that might have commanded respect in another context. The crowd's tone altered as they moved among these effigies. The laughter was more subdued, the remarks more cautious, as if each visitor felt, however irrationally, that the eyes of the condemned might resent too open a mirth. Holmes moved slowly, his gaze passing not only over the figures, but along the floor, the walls, the gas brackets, the very pattern of shadows between the plinths. He paused once to examine a minute darkening upon the cuff of a wax hand, touching it lightly with the tip of his gloved finger, and then raising that finger briefly to his nostrils. Watson saw the faint compression of his lips that denoted the filing away of some impression for later consideration. When Madame Varenne, in the course of her attentions to various distinguished guests, drifted near them, Holmes nodded toward the stain. "Your artist has spared no detail, madame," he remarked. "This gentleman appears to have been preserved with a degree of realism that might almost be considered cruel." She glanced at the figure and then away again, a little too rapidly. "The public demands sensation, monsieur," she said. "If the likeness is too gentle, they say it is not like. We must show vice as it is, or else they are disappointed." "And yet," Holmes murmured, half to himself, "there are certain touches which seem to have been added without any corresponding instruction from the courts or the newspapers. Here, for example." He did not elaborate, but Watson, following his gaze, thought he detected a slight irregularity beneath the painted surface at the base of the throat, as if something less artful had been clumsily concealed. They had nearly completed the circuit of the chamber when Holmes's steps slowed and then stopped altogether. He stood before a figure which, placed in a recess between two more prominent exhibits, might easily have escaped a casual glance. It was that of a man in middle life, dressed in sober, middle-class attire. A dark frock coat, waistcoat, and trousers of a cut neither fashionable nor shabby. The hands were clasped loosely before him, the head inclined a fraction to one side, and the face, though unremarkable, bore an expression of mild surprise, as if the subject had turned to answer an unexpected question. There was no placard at his feet, no name, no crime, no date of execution. "Curious," Holmes said softly. Watson felt, without knowing why, a slight tightening in his chest. There was nothing overtly monstrous about this effigy. Indeed, its very ordinariness made it seem less theatrical than the rest. Yet there was a quality in the posture, in the angle at which the neck emerged from the collar, that disturbed the eye. The skin, beneath its thin coating of wax, seemed less uniformly tinted than in the other figures, and there was a certain rigidity about the shoulders, a set to the jaw, that Watson, from his medical experience, associated less with the sculptor's art than with the effects of certain well-known processes upon recently deceased flesh. "Is this one of your monsters, madame?" Holmes inquired, as Madame Varenne, alerted by some instinct of proprietorship, approached with a little swish of silk. She hesitated, and in that hesitation there was more eloquence than in any protestation. "It is a trial piece only, monsieur," she said at last. "A study from life, you understand. We have not yet decided whether to include it in the exhibition proper." "Indeed." Holmes's tone was light. "Your modeler has surpassed himself in this instance. The resemblance to life is remarkable. One might almost say that if the gentleman were to draw breath, he would step down from his pedestal and join the throng without attracting any special notice." At that moment, a fresh wave of visitors entered the chamber, pressing close behind them. A stray elbow jostled Watson's arm, and he instinctively reached out to steady himself, his hand brushing, for the briefest instant, against the sleeve of the nameless figure. The sensation that met his fingers was not what he had expected. The cloth, though cold, had beneath it a resistance, a tension that no mere stuffing or armature could explain. It was the feel of flesh, preserved yet not wholly surrendered to rigidity, held unnaturally upright. He drew back, a momentary dizziness passing over him. His eyes, drawn almost against his will, rose from the sleeve to the face. In that same heartbeat, a tiny thing occurred which, had he been of more nervous temperament, might have sent him crying out with the rest. A fly, which had been circling lazily in the warm air of the chamber, alighted upon the cheek of the figure just below the right eye. Watson watched it, hardly breathing, as it crawled along the waxen skin, paused, and then moved on. There was no flicker, no quiver of the eyelid, nothing to break the illusion that this was but a model. Yet in the depths of those glassy eyes, he fancied he saw not the emptiness of artifice, but the dull, fixed stare of one who has looked his last upon the world. When he turned to Holmes, he found his friend already observing him with an expression in which keen interest and grave concern were mingled. "You felt it too, Watson," Holmes murmured, so low that even Madame Varenne, standing within arm's length, could not catch the words. Watson swallowed, his mouth dry. "That is no mere figure," he replied, his voice equally hushed. "If my experience goes for anything, that man has not been dead so very long." Holmes's hand closed for an instant upon his arm. "Then I fear, my dear fellow," he said, "that London has acquired a new horror under the guise of entertainment." "We must have this chamber cleared," Lestrade informed, "and the doors closed. For unless all my senses deceive me, we are standing in the presence not of wax, but of murder." The reaction to Holmes's declaration was not immediate, for he spoke so quietly that the violins in the orchestra all but drowned his words. Yet Watson saw in his friend's eyes that swift narrowing, that inward tightening of purpose that accompanied every moment when conjecture hardened suddenly into certainty. Holmes stepped back from the figure and surveyed the chamber with a calmness that contrasted sharply with Watson's rising apprehension. In such moments, Holmes seemed to grow taller, his bearing more sharply defined, as though he shed every trace of idleness and assumed his true form. He moved at once to Lestrade, who stood near the entrance conversing with a portly gentleman of the press. The inspector's face changed when Holmes whispered urgently into his ear. His brows drew together, and the habitual skepticism that sharpened his expression wavered beneath something darker and more troubled. He excused himself abruptly from his companion and turned toward the recess where the nameless figure stood, beckoning two constables forward. Their boots echoed across the polished floor as they approached, the sound drawing curious glances from nearby onlookers. A murmur began to ripple through the chamber, small at first, then growing with the instinctive tightening of bodies toward spectacle. One lady gave a small laugh, thinking perhaps that some theatrical demonstration was afoot. Another gentleman craned his neck, his monocle glinting as he stood on tiptoe for a better view. Holmes cast a swift glance at Watson, and in that glance was a request unspoken: silence, composure, vigilance. Lestrade reached the figure at last, and for a moment the scene held its breath. He extended a hand and touched the waxen face with the back of his knuckles, as though testing for warmth. The inspector's stern features clouded. He leaned forward, peering more closely, then drew back with a faint twitch of revulsion. "God preserve us," he muttered. "If this be what you say, Holmes, then the Yard will have a scandal of no small magnitude." Holmes replied in a tone pitched low, but not so low that Watson could not make out the words. "Take the body down quietly, if you value discretion. London has a morbid appetite, and there are those who would immortalize such a discovery and caricature by dawn. Let us see what lies beneath the wax before gossip does our work for us." Lestrade hesitated, his authority warring with the unwillingness to transform a public amusement into a scene of horror. But prudence prevailed. He ordered the constables to assist him, and together they lifted the figure from its plinth. The movement was awkward and strained, for the body was heavier than any wax sculpture ought to be, and as it shifted, a faint, crackling noise arose from beneath the coat, as though layers of stiffened fabric and hardened substance resisted the change of posture. A soft cry escaped a woman nearby, not loud enough to be hysterical, but sharp enough to draw further eyes. The crowd pressed closer, their curiosity now magnified by a strange unease. Madame Varenne swept forward, pale as parchment, her voice tremulous, yet still possessed of a veneer of authority. She demanded to know why her exhibit was being mishandled, and on whose orders such indignity was imposed. Lestrade attempted to reassure her with a few curt phrases, but she seemed scarcely to hear him. Her gaze had fixed upon the hanging arm of the figure, where the wax had begun to crack slightly at the elbow, revealing beneath it something neither dye nor sculptor's clay. Holmes laid a hand upon her wrist, firm but not unkind. "Madame, I beg of you, permit us to do our duty. You may be entirely innocent of what lies before us, and if so, you will require the protection of the law rather than its opposition." She stared at him for a long moment, her lips parting as though to speak, yet no sound emerged. At length she nodded once, a gesture of resignation rather than agreement, and turned away, pressing a handkerchief to her mouth. The constables bore the figure to a narrow door at the side of the chamber, behind which lay a passage used by attendants. Holmes signaled Watson to accompany him, and together they followed Lestrade into a dimly lit service corridor, closing the door behind them. The sounds of the exhibition hall faded, replaced by the echo of footsteps and the hiss of gas through a poorly maintained pipe. The air was cooler here, tinged with dust and a peculiar sharp odor, part preservative, part decay. The group halted before a small preparation room, where newly repaired figures were sometimes dressed and painted before being returned to their plinths. A single lamp illuminated the wooden table, and the body was laid upon it with care. Lestrade dismissed the constables and bolted the door. Only Holmes, Watson, the inspector, and the silent effigy remained. Holmes removed his gloves and set them aside, his expression composed, his movements precise. He took up a small penknife from the table, likely a tool of the museum staff, and turned his attention to the crack at the elbow where the wax had begun to fracture. Watson stood ready, though whether to steady the body or to steady his own nerves, he could not have said. Holmes drew the blade along the fissure with a slow, deliberate motion. The wax parted under the pressure, peeling back like brittle skin. Beneath it lay a seam of hardened material, and still deeper, the unmistakable texture of flesh, discolored by chemical treatment, but bearing the shape and grain that no sculptor could perfectly imitate. A faint odor rose from the incision, dry yet sour, like old garments sealed in a cellar. Watson felt a tremor pass through him. Not fear, precisely, but the solemn recognition of death in a place dedicated to imitation. His eyes traveled from the exposed flesh to the face, whose half-surprised expression now seemed infinitely more tragic. Holmes straightened. "There can be no doubt. This is a corpse, preserved with some artistry, coated and displayed among the waxen criminals." Lestrade exhaled slowly. "This will not remain quiet for long. Then we must hasten. Holmes replied. "Watson, if you would examine the condition of the joints and musculature, we may determine how recently death occurred." Watson stepped forward, bending over the body with professional focus. He touched the stiffness of the hands, noting the resistance in the fingers and the lingering elasticity in the muscle groups of the forearm. The posture in which the body had been arranged suggested that rigor had been manipulated or arrested at a calculated stage, neither wholly advanced nor entirely resolved. "At most a matter of days," he said finally. "Perhaps less. The preservation has masked the usual signs, but not wholly erased them." Holmes nodded. "I suspected as much. Now, observe the nails. There appears to be some residue beneath them, dark, granular. Lestrade, have you a small envelope?" The inspector produced a scrap of paper, and Holmes scraped the substance free with meticulous care. Watson saw in his friend's absorbed concentration that the mystery had already begun to coil itself around his faculties, drawing him deeper with every detail. "There are marks upon the throat as well," Holmes murmured, touching the area just beneath the collar. "They are faint, hidden by the wax, but unmistakable. The man was not merely murdered. He was strangled, and with considerable force." Lestrade cursed under his breath. "Do you mean to say he was killed expressly to be placed here?" Holmes paused, gazing down at the lifeless face. "It is one possibility. Another is that his murderers sought a place where his disappearance would go unnoticed, where he might stand, ironically enough, among the dead without attracting suspicion. A wax museum is a perfect vault, if one can master the art of imitation." Watson shuddered. The notion was dreadfully logical, dreadful in its simplicity. A corpse placed among the lifeless could remain undiscovered indefinitely. Thousands might pass within inches of it, their eyes registering it merely as spectacle. Holmes folded his arms. "We stand at the threshold of a design, Lestrade. Whether born of greed, blackmail, or something more sinister, I cannot yet say. But this is no ordinary murder." Lestrade tightened his jaw. "I'll have men posted at every exit. No one leaves the building until we know who is responsible." Holmes's expression softened into something resembling pity. "My dear Inspector, if the culprits are as cunning as I suspect, they are long gone. Or perhaps closer to us than we imagine. In either case, locking the doors will confine only the innocent." Watson spoke then, compelled by a question that had formed in his mind. "Holmes, why this figure? Why display him at all? Surely his killers might have disposed of him more quietly." Holmes's eyes flickered with that peculiar gleam that signaled a deduction half-formed. Perhaps the body itself is a message, or perhaps it was intended merely as one piece in a larger tableau. For now, the motive lies shrouded. But mark me, Watson, the dead do not find their way into such company by accident." He turned back to the figure and touched the waxen cheek once more, as though seeking an answer from the silence. "We must speak with Madame Varenne again," he said, "but gently. She may know more than she realizes, or she may be in grave danger." Watson nodded, though he could not dispel the sense that some unseen gaze was watching from beyond the walls, waiting for their first misstep. The museum above thrummed faintly with music and laughter, a world of merriment unaware of the horror beneath its feet. Holmes extinguished the lamp, leaving the room in half-shadow. "Come, Watson. The night grows long, and the waxen dead do not speak, but the living may yet betray themselves." They slipped back into the corridor, the door closing softly behind them, and the hall of figures waited above, silent, glittering, and now unmistakably sinister. The corridor opened once more into the main hall of the museum, where the atmosphere had scarcely altered despite the removal of one silent occupant. The orchestra had resumed its bright melodies, and the crowd, though subtly thinned, still wandered between the waxen statesmen and celebrated beauties. A few curious faces turned toward the discreet door from which Holmes and Watson emerged, but the greater number seemed determined to enjoy the evening, uninterrupted by anything so prosaic as reason. It struck Watson that London required spectacle as surely as it required bread, and if that spectacle bordered on the morbid, so much the better. Holmes paused at the threshold, surveying the hall with an expression that combined calculation and irritation. "Observe them, Watson," he murmured. "1,000 eyes, yet not one that sees. The truth may stand inches from their noses, and still they would require a placard to recognize it." Watson followed his gaze. Men in polished boots and ladies in feathered hats strolled arm in arm, remarking upon the royal likenesses and admiring the precision of the sculptor's art. None suspected that a corpse had been borne past them minutes earlier, disguised as entertainment. If the truth had been proclaimed aloud, Watson suspected half the hall would have fainted, while the other half would have clamored for tickets to see the body more closely, as though death were merely another performance. Madame Varenne awaited them near the balustrade of the central staircase, her posture composed but her complexion unnaturally pale beneath the gaslight. Her eyes, usually sharp and commanding, now bore the wild brightness of a lantern flickering in a rising wind. When Holmes approached, she inclined her head with stiff formality, though her gloved hands twisted together with restless motion. "Inspector Lestrade has informed me of your suspicions," she said, her voice taut. "I hope you do not intend to make a spectacle of my establishment. I've labored many years to create a place of refinement and education." Holmes regarded her for a long moment, his expression inscrutable. "It is precisely your reputation that I seek to preserve, madame. Yet you must answer plainly. How long has that unnamed figure been in your possession?" She flinched as though struck. He arrived with the others. Crated, labeled, and accounted for. The sculptor insisted he was a new commission, a study from life. "I trusted him. I had no reason to suspect—" "But you did," Holmes interjected softly. "I saw your reaction when I inquired. You knew something was amiss, if not the full truth. When did that doubt arise?" Her lips trembled and she lowered her gaze. "To question my modeler is to question the very life of this establishment. He is a genius, but one who requires indulgence. I feared he might abandon me if I pressed too strongly. The museum would be nothing without his art." Holmes's voice softened. "You feared him?" She looked up sharply. "Not as a woman fears cruelty, but as a tamer fears the beast whose power he must rely upon. His imagination is boundless, Mr. Holmes. He sees life where others see only clay. I thought his eccentricities harmless, eccentricities of genius. I thought the figure merely too realistic." Watson felt an unexpected pang of pity. Madame Varenne was no villain. She was a woman entangled in the consequences of ambition and association. Yet pity was not proof, and Holmes was not one to let sentiment obscure judgment. "Madame," he said, "you must provide us the modeler's full name, address, and any correspondence between you. And you must do so before the night is out." She hesitated, torn between self-preservation and ruin, then drew from her reticule a small folded card. "His name is Etienne Marot. He keeps a private studio adjoining the museum. The card bears the entry to his workroom, but I beg of you, be cautious. He's not violent, I think, but he is unpredictable." Holmes accepted the card without comment, though Watson noted the spark of interest that lit his features. Madness, genius, and crime often shared neighboring lodgings, and Holmes seemed always to know how to find the door between them. Before Madame Varenne could speak further, a commotion arose near the far end of the hall. A group of visitors had gathered around a particular exhibit, not with polite interest but with whispering agitation. The colored glass lamps threw uneven shadows across the tableau, and Watson caught the faint, uneasy stir of voices repeating the same phrases. "Too real. Unnatural. Ought not to look so." Holmes was already moving, weaving through the crowd with long, purposeful strides. Watson followed close, feeling that familiar acceleration of pulse which signaled the deepening of mystery. When they reached the exhibit, they found the onlookers staring at one of the criminal effigies, a gaunt man in prison garb, his wrists bound before him, his head inclined in the attitude of a penitent awaiting judgment. A young woman pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "It blinked," she whispered. "I swear it did." Just then. Her companion scoffed. "Nerves. Bad lighting. You've let Madame's theatrics unsettle you." Holmes ignored them both and stepped nearer, his face inches from the figure. Watson saw him lean forward, scrutinizing the eyelids, the faint texture of skin beneath, the joints of the hands. For a long moment he did not move. Then he straightened abruptly. "This one is wax," he said in a tone of controlled relief, though fashioned with such skill that even I might doubt it in dimmer light. The crowd sighed, some with disappointment, others with embarrassment. The tension dissolved into laughter. Yet Holmes did not join in. He circled the effigy, noting the placement of the feet, the shadows cast by the brackets above, the glaze on the eyes. Watson lowered his voice. "Did you truly suspect another corpse?" Holmes's answer was grave. "When one body has been concealed in a collection of effigies, one must not assume there is only one. Murderers rarely risk a plan for a single throw of the dice. If this was indeed an instrument of concealment, it may also have served as an instrument of communication." Communication. Holmes's eyes narrowed. A meeting place where men may stand invisibly among statues. A message placed in a waxen palm. Instructions passed without speech. Consider that a letter is traceable, a telegram even more so, but a small object placed at the feet of a wax effigy and removed by another. Who would take notice? Watson felt the unease return like a tide. Then the museum may be more than a hiding place. Precisely. And tonight's unveiling may have provided the perfect cover for a final rendezvous, one that required the removal of a participant. Before Watson could reply, Lestrade rejoined them, having taken measures to secure the body in the preparation room under guard. His complexion was mottled with strain. "Holmes, I've posted men at the exits, though I've kept things quiet. I'll not have a stampede on my hands. Now, what do we do about this Marotte fellow? If he's responsible, I'll have the bracelets on him before sunrise." Holmes shook his head. "We must observe before we arrest. There is more here than simple murder. Let us examine his workspace. If he is innocent, we may yet prevent a grave injustice. If guilty, the evidence will condemn him more thoroughly than your zeal." Lestrade huffed, but he yielded. Holmes had a way of commanding authority even when he possessed none officially. They left the hall, moving toward a side corridor, accessible only to staff. Madame Varenne watched their departure from the balcony, her face unreadable, like a mask whose sculptor had forgotten to add emotion. Watson wondered whether she feared exposure or justice more. The corridor to Marotte's studio was narrow and unadorned, lit by a single flickering lamp that cast the walls in long stains of shadow. Holmes led the way, consulting the small silver key attached to the card. The door at the end was heavy, fitted with an iron hasp and a keyhole worn smooth from frequent use. Holmes inserted the key. Before he turned it, he spoke. "Prepare yourself, Watson. This room may contain answers or horrors." He turned the key slowly. The lock gave a soft click, and the door swung open on silent hinges. The room within was dark. Not merely unlit, but dark. The kind of oppressive shadow that felt deliberate, as though light itself had been banished. The smell struck them first, a mingling of damp clay, cold stone, lamp oil, and something else beneath it. Something faintly metallic. Holmes stepped inside, striking a match. The brief flare illuminated. Shelves hung with plaster masks, their empty sockets staring like pale ghosts. Beneath them sat half-formed limbs, torsos wrapped in cloth, wax heads without bodies and bodies without faces. But what drew Watson's gaze most sharply was the center of the room, where a figure sat in a wooden chair, upright and motionless, shrouded in a heavy canvas cloth. Holmes moved forward and the match burned to his fingertips. He let it fall and struck another. Watson felt his breath catch. The shape beneath the cloth was unmistakably human. Shoulders, spine, bowed head. But what marked it as dreadful was the chair itself. It was bolted to the floor, and beneath it, pooling like the remnant of some dark ritual, was a glistening ring of dried wax, fallen in tight concentric circles as though layer after layer had been applied from above. Holmes reached out and lifted a corner of the cloth. What lay beneath was not wax, it was flesh, pale, still, and unmistakably dead. A second corpse. Watson staggered back, hand gripping the edge of a table to steady himself. Holmes drew a slow breath, his expression hardening to steel. "This," he said quietly, "is no accident. Someone has been refining their craft." Lestrade's voice was a hoarse whisper. "Holmes, how many more bodies do you think there are?" Holmes did not look away from the corpse. "Enough," he said, "that the museum above is not an exhibition, but a graveyard masquerading as art." The silence that followed Holmes's pronouncement seemed to thicken the air of the studio, pressing upon the lungs and nerves alike. Watson, whose medical training had accustomed him to the presence of the dead in many surroundings, nevertheless felt an unease here that he could not wholly attribute to profession. Hospitals, battlefields, and mortuaries had their own grim honesty. Death declared itself in the open, and the living responded with duty. But in this cramped chamber, with its half-finished figures and its smell of oil and clay, death had been invited as a collaborator, and then disguised, as though the very notion of a clear boundary between the living and the lifeless had been willfully obscured. Holmes lifted the canvas entirely, folding it back upon itself with a neatness that contrasted oddly with the macabre nature of the scene. The figure in the chair was that of a man in his middle years, spare of frame, dressed in a dark suit of respectable cut that had not yet quite surrendered its creases from recent wear. His head was bowed slightly forward, as if in thought or fatigue, and the eyes, half-lidded, stared at the floor with a dull glaze that caught the lamplight without returning it. Around his shoulders and arms clung a residue of hardened substance, dripped and brushed in uneven layers. Wax, no doubt, applied in stages and then scraped away again, as though he had been used for practice in the ghastly art perfected in the hall above. Watson stepped closer, his initial shock yielding to professional scrutiny. He touched the exposed skin at the neck. It was cold, but not so far advanced in its changes as the body they had examined earlier. The fingers, slightly curled, retained a trace more flexibility. There was a faint, almost imperceptible odor of some chemical preparation lingering about the hair and collar, as if attempts had been made to slow the ordinary processes of decay. "This man has not been dead as long as the other," Watson said, forcing his voice to steadiness. "The interval cannot be great, but it exists. I should place his death within the last 48 hours, perhaps less." Holmes inclined his head. "A newer experiment, then, or perhaps a different purpose. Observe the chair, Watson." The chair bolted to the floor was stained and roughened where liquids had dripped and hardened over time. Along the edges of the seat and arms, Watson saw grooves worn into the wood as if by the repeated friction of bonds. At the wrists of the corpse there were faint abrasions, reddened beneath the waxy streaks that had not entirely concealed them. "He was bound here alive," Watson murmured. "There has been a struggle. However he died, it was not gentle." Lestrade, who had remained near the doorway as if reluctant to commit himself fully to the shadowed room, now stepped nearer with visible reluctance. His jaw was tight, and his eyes moved rapidly from the corpse to the scattered models and sketches, as though expecting yet another horror to reveal itself at any moment. "Do you recognize him?" Holmes asked. The inspector studied the face, his frown deepening. "I can't say that I do. He looks like half the clerks in the city. Respectable, nervous, nothing out of the ordinary. I'll have his likeness circulated, though we'd best keep the particulars quiet until we know more. The papers would make a circus of this." Holmes nodded. "We must discover who he was, and swiftly. The dead seldom speak, but their habits and appointments do. Let us see what this gentleman carried with him when he came to sit in this abominable chair." With delicate fingers, he began to search the dead man's pockets, turning out their contents upon a bare section of work table. A handkerchief, neatly folded and marked with the initial C in one corner. A small notebook with its last pages torn out. A few coins, a ring of keys, and at the very bottom of the waistcoat pocket, a crumpled scrap of paper stiff with dried wax. Holmes smoothed the scrap upon the table. It bore a fragment of printed text, the bottom portion of what had perhaps once been a page torn from a circular or notice. The words were incomplete, yet suggestive. "Terrys of the firm will attend to inquiries between the hours." And below, barely legible, the remnants of a name ending in Sun and Vale. "A city firm, beyond doubt," Holmes murmured. "Merchants or solicitors. We shall see tomorrow which. For now, note the keys. The second from the left bears the mark of a strong box manufacturer in Bishopsgate. And this one," he lifted a smaller, more delicately fashioned key, "is of the sort used for private drawers in office desks. Our friend was a man entrusted with access, perhaps to documents, perhaps to funds." Watson bent over the ring. "If we can determine the firm whose keys these fit, we may learn who he was and what brought him into the orbit of this place." "Precisely. As for Marot," Holmes added, his gaze flicking around the studio, "his absence is too eloquent to require commentary. A man does not abandon his workroom, leaving his subjects half-completed and his victims bolted to chairs, unless he has good reason to expect unwelcome visitors." Lestrade swore softly. "We must have him, Holmes. A man who uses corpses for his art is as much a danger as any cutthroat." "Do not be too swift in apportioning blame," Holmes replied, though there was no softness in his tone. "Marot may be monster or pawn, or some unhappy combination of both. Until we know who commissioned these horrors and who profited by them, we must keep an open mind. For the moment, your men should seal this room. Nothing touched, nothing removed, until daylight and a more thorough examination can be made." Lestrade assented, though with poor grace. He was a man who preferred the simplicity of a culprit in handcuffs to the mist of conjecture in which Holmes often moved with such ease. Yet even he recognized that the ordinary machinery of the yard was ill-suited to a crime whose workshop was a sculptor's studio and whose victims had stood displayed in evening clothes beneath gaslight. They left the dead man in his bolted chair, restored to that dreadful mockery of repose, and stepped back into the corridor. Lestrade summoned 2 constables to stand guard, their faces blanching when they glimpsed the interior of the studio. The key was turned with a decision that made the lock rattle. "It grows late, Holmes," Watson said quietly as they made their way back toward the vestibule. "Do you propose to continue here tonight?" Holmes shook his head. "The living threads of this case lie beyond these walls. We have looked upon its consequences. Tomorrow we shall pursue its causes. We must know who our dead men were and what paths led them beneath Madame Varenne's roof. I suspect those paths run through offices and parlors as much as through alleys and cellars." They emerged once more into the main hall. The crowd had thinned at last. Only a few stragglers remained, consulting their watches and moving toward the cloakroom. The orchestra was packing up its instruments with weary efficiency. Madame Varenne stood alone at the foot of the grand stair, her shoulders drooping as though the structure of her outward composure had finally given way. Holmes approached her with a courtesy that bore in it no trace of accusation, though Watson knew full well that his friend believed her to be concealing more than she had yet revealed. "Madame," he said, "we must trouble you with further questions tomorrow. For tonight I urge you to close the museum and admit no one to the Chamber of Figures or to Monsieur Marot's studio. Inspector Lestrade will station men at the entrances." She gave a mirthless laugh. "You speak as if I might still conduct business while death sits in my chair and on my plinths. The museum is finished, Mr. Holmes. London may forgive almost anything, but it will not forgive the discovery that its amusements have been made from its neighbors. I shall cooperate fully. What else is left to me?" "There is always the truth," Holmes replied quietly. "It may yet prove your ally, however late it arrives." Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "You may find, monsieur, that truth is less a friend than you believe. Good evening." Outside, the night had deepened. The street lamps cast trembling halos upon pavements slick with recent drizzle, and the rumble of distant wheels mingled with the cries of newsboys hawking the last editions. Holmes hailed a passing hansom, and soon they were rattling back toward Baker Street, the horses' hooves striking a measured rhythm upon the stones. For some time Holmes remained silent, his chin sunk upon his chest, his gaze fixed upon some point in the darkness beyond the small side window. Watson knew better than to disturb such meditations with questions, yet his own mind churned with images: the nameless figure among the waxen criminals, the second corpse bolted to the floor, the ring of wax like the drip of some grotesque sacrament. At last, Holmes stirred. "We have, at present, 2 dead men connected with the museum," he said. "One exhibited, one prepared, but not yet displayed. Both preserved in a fashion that suggests planning and experiment. What do you make of it, Watson?" Watson considered. At first glance, one might suppose a madman, using the resources of the museum to indulge a private mania. Yet the keys, the scrap mentioning a firm, the careful nature of the concealment, they suggest method rather than mere frenzy. I cannot shake the impression that these men served some purpose beyond the gratification of a diseased imagination. Holmes smiled faintly in the dimness. "Your instincts do you credit. Madness may decorate a crime, but it rarely builds its framework. There is a design here, and we have glimpsed only its lower courses. Tomorrow we shall begin with the city. Sun and Vale may be only a fragment, but it is a fragment of an address, and London has a way of yielding its secrets to those who ask the right questions." Watson nodded, though skepticism stirred alongside hope. "And Marot? Marot is a piece upon the board who has moved too suddenly out of sight," Holmes replied. "I would wager that he has not fled altogether. Men of his temperament are tethered to their own obsessions. They cannot long endure absence from the scene of their work, even when that scene has become dangerous. We may yet draw him forth, if we can discover what he values most." The cab turned into Baker Street at last, and the familiar facade of number 221B came into view. The lamplight in the sitting-room window, the faint outline of Mrs. Hudson's silhouette as she moved about her duties. Watson felt, as he often did upon returning there after some grim expedition, a rush of gratitude for that small island of order in a city whose undercurrents could be so dark. Later, as he sat by the fire with his notebook open and his pen idle between his fingers, he watched Holmes at the chemical table, where beakers and glass tubes glinted in the lamplight. Holmes was examining the residue scraped from beneath the dead man's nails, holding it against various reagents, noting each reaction with a small, satisfied nod or a brief, discontented frown. At length he straightened, wiped his hands, and turned to Watson. "There is more of the earth than of the shop counter in these traces," he said. "A certain clay, mixed with a grainy dust that is not of London's streets. We shall know more when daylight shows us where our second victim trod before he sat in that chair." Watson closed his notebook without having written a single line. The story was not yet ready to be set down. Its shape was still forming, like a figure emerging from wax beneath a sculptor's hand. As he banked the fire and prepared at last to retire, one thought lingered with him more strongly than the rest. Somewhere in the sleeping city, Beneath gaslit windows and the steady ticking of clocks, there moved the hand that had raised those men from life to lifeless display. And as Holmes extinguished the lamp and the room fell into shadow, Watson could not shake the feeling that the unseen sculptor of this affair was already at work on his next arrangement. The night closed over Baker Street, and the secrets buried beneath the wax museum waited for morning. By morning, the rain had ceased, but the streets retained that dull grey sheen which London wears even in fairer weather, as though the city's very stones held memory of soot and toil. Watson woke later than usual, his sleep troubled by dreams in which unmoving faces turned suddenly to meet his gaze, their waxen lips parting to speak in voices he could not quite hear. When he descended to breakfast, he found the table laid, Mrs. Hudson bustling with her customary quiet industry, and Holmes already installed before the fire, long limbs folded, pipe in hand, his eyes half closed in that peculiar state between waking thought and active deduction. Without looking up, Holmes spoke. "You slept poorly, Watson." "I might say the same of you," Watson replied, taking his seat. "Your chair bears the imprint of long occupation." "A brief vigil," Holmes murmured. "There are times when a case does not so much present itself to my mind as impose itself, like a guest who refuses to depart. Last night was such a time." Watson poured coffee for them both, its fragrance cutting through the chill of the morning. "Have you reached any new conclusions?" Holmes opened his eyes then, the grey irises sharp as steel. "Only that our second victim was not an isolated experiment. He bore upon his boots a mixture of clay, soot, and industrial grit quite distinct from the dust of Holborn. We shall soon discover its origin, but first, the city." He rose, seizing his coat with the suddenness of a man resuming motion after hours of stillness. Watson finished the last of his toast and followed him out onto Baker Street, where a hansom was summoned with a wave of Holmes's hand. They rode eastward through the waking city, past costermongers arranging fruit beneath striped awnings, clerks hurrying with rolled umbrellas, and chimney pots exhaling ribbons of smoke into the pale air. The great offices of finance and commerce rose like monuments to industry, stony and imposing, their doorways guarded by clerks whose black coats seemed a uniform of seriousness. Holmes alighted before a tall building whose brass plate read, "Hargreaves, Wilson and Vale, merchants and commission agents." Watson recognized the fragment of the torn circular at once. Within, clerks moved like measured machinery, their quills scratching in quiet synchrony. The porter, a round-shouldered fellow with a serviceable politeness, regarded the visitors with cautious interest. "We are seeking information about one of your staff," Holmes said, in that brisk tone which brooked no delay. "A man in middle years, slight of build, bearing keys marked with your firm's insignia." The porter frowned in thought. "That sounds like Mr. Carraway, sir, a confidential clerk. Not here this morning, though he's not one to shirk his hours." "Carraway," Watson murmured, the initial upon the handkerchief. Holmes nodded, but his expression did not lighten. "Might we speak with one of his superiors?" The porter returned with a tall, spare gentleman whose features wore the strained patience of one accustomed to balancing accounts, both numerical and moral. Mr. Vale, for so he introduced himself, confirmed that Carraway had not reported since the previous afternoon, though a message had been received stating he was unwell. Holmes listened without interruption, then asked to see Carraway's desk. They were escorted to a high-ceilinged office where rows of desks stretched beneath skylights stained yellow by years of coal smoke. Carraway's station was neat to the point of severity. A ledger lay open, its last entry half completed, the ink dried mid-stroke as though interrupted suddenly. The desk drawer, unlocked by Carraway's key, revealed papers in precise bundles, yet beneath them, tucked flat against the base, lay a small envelope sealed with plain wax. Holmes broke it gently. Inside was a slip of paper bearing only a short message in a cramped hand. Friday. After closing, Bring all records. No delay. Beneath it, a symbol resembling an inverted crown with two crossed lines. Holmes held the paper up to the light, his brow furrowing. This is no firm correspondence. It has the look of a summons and not of a legal nature. Do you recognize the mark, Mr. Vale? The man shook his head. It is nothing of our firm's doing. Mr. Carroway was a quiet fellow, punctual, diligent. If he was drawn into something untoward, he gave no sign of it here. Holmes's expression softened marginally. Vice seldom advertises itself in ledgers. Still, your cooperation has been invaluable. We may yet save your clerk's reputation from the misinterpretations of the press. They left the office, the city's steady rhythm swallowing them once more. Holmes walked in silence for several streets, his stride long and rapid, until they reached the river embankment, where barges drifted like heavy shadows, and the wind bore the scent of tar and iron. "It becomes clearer," he said at length. Carroway was not merely kidnapped or slain at random. He carried records, evidence, perhaps, to a meeting held after business hours. Either he sought to expose wrongdoing or he was coerced into facilitating it. Watson tightened his coat against the wind. And the other victim, the man displayed in wax. Possibly another participant, possibly a debt-ridden pawn. We shall not know until we identify him. But mark how the pattern emerges. The museum is not merely a workshop of morbid artistry. It is a theater for transactions best hidden from written archives. Watson shuddered. And the bodies, what purpose could they serve? Holmes's gaze drifted toward the grey water of the Thames. Perhaps leverage, perhaps warning, or perhaps simply convenience. A corpse in wax passes unnoticed where a corpse in the street draws every constable from the nearest station. Before Watson could reply, a boy in a cap dashed toward them, waving an envelope. "Telegram for Mr. Sherlock Holmes." Holmes tore it open. The message was from Lestrade. "Keeper missing, museum sealed. Further disturbance beneath premises. Suspect passageways. Request your presence." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar spark of urgency. "Come, Watson. The night has yielded corpses. The day may yet yield witnesses." They hailed another hansom and were soon racing westward once more. As the museum's facade came into view, stately, unassuming, innocent in its quiet grandeur, Watson felt again that subtle dread, the knowledge that beneath its polished floors and gilded lamps lay the remnants of something dark, deliberate and alive with purpose. At the entrance, Lestrade awaited them, his coat collar turned up, his face drawn. "You're just in time. The night watchman's vanished, and the men stationed below swear they heard movement in the lower vaults." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Then let us descend. Where silence walks, truth may follow." They entered through a staff door and made their way down the narrow stair that led to the undercroft. The air grew colder with each step, and the light dimmed until only their lamps kept the shadows at bay. The stone arches below stretched into darkness, half-ruined remnants of older structures buried beneath the city's restless layers. Holmes lifted his lamp, illuminating a scatter of footprints in the fine dust. Some recent, others older, some light and tentative, others deep with haste. One set, distinct from the rest, led toward a bricked arch, partially obscured by crates. The bricks bore signs of recent tampering, mortar scraped away, dust unsettled. Holmes touched the wall, his voice low. "Someone has passed through here. Recently, and not by chance." Watson heard a faint sound then. Not the creak of timber or the drip of distant water, but a soft shifting like fabric against stone, somewhere beyond the arch. Lestrade gestured to his men. "Stand ready." Holmes pressed his fingertips along the mortar line and then stepped back, his lamp held high. "Watson, observe. The bricks are secured only by pressure, not cement. A concealed passage." He placed both hands against the arch and pushed. The wall gave way with a slow, grinding sigh, revealing a narrow corridor beyond, choked with stale air and darkness stretching like a throat into the unknown. Holmes did not hesitate. He stepped through first, and as they entered the passage one by one, the light of their lamps fell upon something that made every man halt. Not bodies, not statues, but rows of empty pedestals, dozens of them, as though waiting for occupants. Watson felt his blood run cold. "Holmes," he whispered, "this was not done in haste. This was prepared." Holmes's face was grim. "Yes, Watson. And if these pedestals wait for the dead, then someone intends to populate them." A faint sound echoed deeper within the passage. Footsteps, perhaps, or the lingering breath of someone who had fled only moments before. Holmes raised his lamp higher. "We are not alone down here." The silence that followed Holmes's remark was of that peculiar, oppressive kind which does not merely lack sound, but seems instead to muffle it deliberately, as though the shadows themselves conspired to smother all movement. The lanterns cast long, spidery beams along the narrow corridor, making mockeries of their own light. Every step stirred dust that rose like pale breath beneath the arches. It struck Watson that the air here, though still, seemed not dead, but waiting. Holmes pressed forward, his footfalls light despite the uneven stones, and Watson followed with Lestrade and 2 constables close behind. The pedestals, arranged in somber rows on either side, bore marks upon their surfaces. Thin rings where wax had pooled and hardened, scratches from tools, faint smudges of ash that clung like fingerprints. Some bore numbers, scrawled in chalk, others letters, still others no marking at all, as though intended for occupants whose identities were too sensitive to record even in code. The corridor widened into a chamber, arched like a crypt. Discarded wax lay in curls upon the floor, brittle underfoot. Fragments of plaster clung to corners, and upon the wall, half hidden behind a lattice of shadows, someone had drawn a rough diagram in charcoal, circles intersecting lines, with arrows and cryptic initials beside them. Holmes raised his lamp to the markings. His face tightened, and he traced with a fingertip the looping lines. "A plan," he murmured. "Not of the museum above, but of this labyrinth below. See here, these corridors are not mere storage. They connect to older passages, tunnels left from the chapel that once stood upon this ground, from vaults reused, repurposed, forgotten by all, save those who require privacy from the law." Lestrade grimaced. "You mean smugglers, revolutionaries, foreign agents?" "I mean anyone," Holmes replied, his voice cold, "who has need to hide men or messages beyond the reach of ordinary observation. These walls have heard more than prayers, I suspect." Before Watson could respond, a faint clatter sounded from the end of the chamber. It might have been a pebble dislodged by a passing foot, or simply the settling of ancient stone. Yet there was no wind here, no space for chance. Holmes snatched the lamp into one hand and strode toward the noise. The others followed, though Watson noted the constables hesitated. The corridor narrowed once more, slanting downward subtly, as though descending toward the earth's buried throat. The air grew colder, and soon the light reflected off something damp upon the walls, condensation, or perhaps seepage from some forgotten watercourse. Then the passage branched. Holmes stopped abruptly. To the left, the corridor twisted and vanished into darkness where no footprints marked the dust. To the right, the floor bore disturbed patches, scuffs, irregular prints, ending at a rough wooden door studded with iron nails. Holmes knelt and examined the marks with keen precision. 2 sets of feet, one moving swiftly, the other dragging, the latter heavier, perhaps carrying a load. The disturbance is recent, within the last hour, if not minutes. Lestrade motioned to the door. "Shall we force it?" Holmes shook his head. "Patience. A man who flees rarely leaves a door unlocked if he intends to bar pursuit." He placed his hand to the latch. It lifted silently. The door swung inward without resistance. Holmes stepped inside. Watson followed, bracing himself for yet another tableau of death. Instead, the room that opened before them resembled a workshop, yet darker, humbler, and far more secretive than the studio above. There were shelves of jars filled with murky fluids, coils of rope stiffened by old stains, a cauldron blackened with soot, ladles and brushes beside it hardened by wax. A long table bore rows of masks, faces molded from plaster and wax, each expression distinct. Some were grotesque in their agony, others calm as sleep, still others hollow as though emotion had been drained from them. And in the center, upon a low trestle, lay a mold in two halves, one for the front of a human face, one for the back. Fresh wax clung to its edges. Watson felt his throat constrict. "These are not models of criminals." Holmes's voice was low. "No, these are models of ordinary men, workers, clerks, citizens, faces that could vanish without stirring a headline." One of the constables muttered a prayer beneath his breath. Holmes lifted a mask, studying the faint pores, the careful tinting around the eyes, the subtle variation of hue along the jaw. "These are no crude forgeries. This is identity as an instrument, as currency. Imagine a man wishing to pass unrecognized through the city. He dons a face not his own. Now imagine that face worn by a dozen others, a network of ghosts." Watson felt the implications settle upon him like frost. Then the bodies in the museum. "Not displayed merely for spectacle," Holmes said, "but for reference." Lestrade swore. "This goes beyond murder. This is conspiracy of the highest order." Holmes replaced the mask gently. "Of the deepest order, and it is not confined to these rooms." From the far end of the chamber came a soft rustle, followed by the faint creak of footsteps. The sound did not recede. It circled, as though whoever lingered wished to observe rather than flee. Lestrade motioned to the constables. "Who goes there? Show yourself." No reply, only the whisper of breath, then silence. Holmes extinguished his lamp. The others gasped softly as darkness swallowed them, but Holmes's whisper cut through the void. "He waits for light, do not oblige him. Some animals hunt by the moment when flame returns." Watson's pulse thudded in his ears. He could see nothing, not even his own hand before his face. Yet he felt movement in the air, sensed a presence drawing closer, hesitant, assessing. Holmes moved soundlessly past Watson, deeper into the dark. Seconds stretched. A sudden scuffle broke out, fast, chaotic, the thud of bodies against stone. Watson lunged toward the sound, striking his shin on a crate. Lestrade shouted for lanterns. One flared to life, revealing a figure struggling in Holmes's grip. A gaunt man in a torn waistcoat, hair matted, eyes wild with exhaustion and fear. Not Etienne Marot, but someone who had seen him. The man thrashed once more, then sagged, defeated. Holmes pinned him with a hand to the shoulder and released him only when the constables seized his arms. Lestrade stepped forward. "Whoever you are, you'll answer to the yard. Give your name." The man's voice was hoarse, as though from long silence. "Why should I tell you? Anything. You'll not protect me. None of you can. When he returns, he'll silence the lot of you, as he did the others." Holmes's voice was calm, controlled. "He? You speak of Marot?" The man shook his head violently. "No. The sculptor is only a servant. He obeys as he must. It is the other, the one who designed this place, who owns the faces, who chooses who shall glow beneath wax and who shall rot in shadow. Marot only carves what he is told." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with cold stone. "And who is this other?" The man's eyes widened with something like terror. "You walk above his graveyard and think it an exhibition." Holmes leaned closer. "Give us a name." The man swallowed, his voice dropping to a rasp. "They call him the curator." Before Holmes could question further, something echoed from the corridor behind them, a distant, metallic sound, like a door slamming or a gate closing upon its hinges. The man stiffened in the constable's grip, panic overtaking him. "He is here." Holmes lifted the lamp once more, his face grim with resolve. "Then we have little time. Watson, stay close. The shadows of this place are no longer empty." They turned back toward the way they had come, but the corridor that had been open was now shut by a wall of freshly hewn stone. Someone had sealed the exit behind them. The newly sealed wall stood as smooth and unyielding as if it had been part of the tunnel's masonry for a century rather than moments. The faint trace of mortar still hung in the air, the dust not yet settled on the stones. Watson ran his hand along the surface in disbelief. It was cold and solid under his palm, and yet the rapidity with which it had been placed defied ordinary labor. "This cannot have been done in the space of a minute," he said, unable to mask his astonishment. "The passage was open when we entered. We should have heard chiseling, hammering, something." Holmes seized his lantern and brought it close to the seam where stone met stone. "Not built," he murmured, "but moved. The blocks bear signs of sliding rather than setting. Observe the narrow grooves here and the smooth stone against stone. Someone has installed a mechanism beneath the arch capable of repositioning large slabs with very little noise." Lestrade stepped back, his face darkening. "A trap, then? You think we've walked into a snare?" "Perhaps," Holmes replied calmly. "Or perhaps we are being shepherded." The prisoner struggled against the constable's grip, his breath coming in rapid bursts. You see, he is here. He closes, he opens, he chooses. We must not remain. He does not kill swiftly, not unless he has reason. He watches first." Holmes fixed the man with a sharp glance. "You will do better to steady yourself. Panic will not loosen stone." Watson could not help observing that Holmes's tone, though firm, held none of Lestrade's impatience. Instead, it bore the cool authority of a man accustomed to steering others through peril by sheer force of composure. The prisoner's trembling subsided slightly, though his eyes continued to flicker toward the darkness. Holmes turned from the barrier and directed his lamp toward the second corridor branching deeper underground. "Our exit is no longer behind us. Therefore, it lies ahead. If our unseen adversary has gone to such length to contain us, it indicates he has something yet to hide, and perhaps something left to do." Lestrade grimaced. "Forward, then. But I'll have pistols drawn. This is no place for bare hands." The constables nodded grimly and brandished their revolvers. Watson adjusted his own, though he knew well that firearms in confined passages were as likely to deafen or misfire as protect. Holmes, as ever, carried no weapon beyond his cane and his mind. They moved onward. The tunnel narrowed again, so tight that they were forced to walk in single file. The air grew damp, laced with the musk of earth undisturbed for decades. In places, the foundation stones showed cracks where roots had wormed their way through, like veins creeping through the earth's flesh. The prisoner walked between Holmes and Lestrade, stumbling often, but no one paused. The thought of remaining in one place seemed worse than pressing forward. After several minutes, the passage widened and opened into a chamber of surprising height. Their lanterns revealed columns of stone rising like ribs, supporting an arching ceiling blackened by time. Beneath that vault stretched rows of wooden crates, each stenciled with numbers and letters in different hands. Some bore foreign markings, French, German, a few Russian, while others were labeled with nothing more than symbols. Holmes inspected the markings by lamplight. These are not coffins, though the shape might suggest it. They are shipping crates. The dimensions match transport for statuary, or bodies. Lestrade glowered. Bodies shipped across borders. For what purpose? Holmes's reply was soft. Smuggling, espionage, blackmail, identity exchange. The uses of the dead are as numerous as the motives of the living. He cut open one crate with a blade borrowed from Watson's pocket knife. Within lay a wax figure swathed in linen, unfinished, its face a blank canvas awaiting features, its hands half-sculpted. Yet its torso bore the unmistakable contours of a once-living chest. Watson stepped closer. This one was begun but abandoned. The skin underneath the wax appears slightly withered, older than the corpses we discovered, but not ancient. Holmes nodded. A trial subject, an experiment in preservation. Whoever orchestrates this endeavor learned by degrees, each body closer to perfection than the last. Lestrade frowned. Perfection for what? Before Holmes could answer, the prisoner spoke again, his voice cracking with strain. To create what cannot decay, what cannot testify, to preserve what ought to rot. The living fear the law, the dead fear nothing. The curator seeks an army of silence. Watson shuddered. The man seemed half mad, yet there was a ghastly logic to his words. Holmes turned from the crate and swept the chamber with his lamp. This room is not the destination, it is storage. The heart lies deeper. A faint metallic click echoed from somewhere ahead, too delicate for a footstep, yet too deliberate for settling stone. Holmes raised a hand, commanding silence. The group halted. The prisoner froze, eyes wide. Watson held his breath, straining to hear. Another click, then the soft scrape of metal against metal. Holmes moved forward with slow, measured precision. The others followed. At the far end of the chamber stood another door, iron-banded, fitted with a heavy lock. Unlike the previous entrances, this one bore a mark upon its center, a sigil shaped like the inverted crown from the note found in Carraway's desk, but etched more precisely, engraved rather than scrawled. Holmes reached out and brushed the metal with his fingertips, as if feeling the pulse beneath the surface. The iron was warm. "Someone passed through recently," he whispered. "Heat lingers upon metal longer than upon air." Lestrade drew his pistol. "We force it." Holmes's voice remained calm but unyielding. "No shots. The tunnel may reverberate or collapse. A manual breach." Two constables set their shoulders against the door, but Holmes stopped them with a gesture. "Wait. The hinge pins are external and removable. A lock is a warning to the unobservant, not a barrier to the observant." He removed the pins with the flat end of his cane and pocket knife. The door sagged, then swung inward with a groan. The room beyond was small, little more than an antechamber, but what sat within it drew Watson's breath short. A row of 8 plinths, each bearing a figure veiled in dark cloth. Not wax figures, cloth-covered bodies. Fresh ones. Watson felt his pulse quicken. There was no formal arrangement, no stage of exhibition. These bodies were newly obtained, their forms still stiff with the tension of death, wrapped in preparation rather than display. He counted the shapes. 8, each roughly matching the height of an adult, some unmistakably male, others perhaps female. Holmes approached the nearest and lifted the cloth. A pale face stared back, eyes closed, mouth parted slightly, as though frozen mid-breath. The features were strikingly ordinary. Watson whispered, "Do you recognize him?" Holmes shook his head. "No, and that is precisely the point." Lestrade swallowed audibly. "They're not criminals. They're citizens, unremarkable, as if chosen for blending into crowds." The prisoner spoke, his voice a trembling murmur. They were taken for what they knew, and for what they did not know they knew. Holmes lowered the cloth with solemn precision. "These bodies are not trophies. They are raw material." Watson's unease sharpened into horror. "For what? More wax figures?" Holmes turned toward him, eyes bright with grim revelation. "Not merely figures. Replacements." Watson stared, uncomprehending. Holmes continued, "Imagine an agent removed and substituted, a clerk dead, his likeness reproduced in wax, a double sent in his place. Letters sent, transactions executed, secrets extracted, all while the world believes him alive. Meanwhile, his body stands among waxworks, unnoticed, a perfect disguise. Lestrade's voice cracked. But who would command such a scheme? Who has resources to exploit both the living and the dead? Holmes took a slow breath. Only someone with access to power under the guise of culture and anonymity. Someone whose dealings are shrouded in the respectable veneer of art and public fascination. Someone known to the city only for harmless exhibitions. Watson felt the answer gather like storm clouds. The prisoner whispered again, barely audible. "You understand? The curator does not sculpt wax. He sculpts society." Holmes turned sharply to question him further, but before he could speak, a shudder passed through the ground beneath their feet. Dust drifted from the vaulted ceiling. Somewhere behind them, a door slammed hard enough to echo through the chambers like a cannon report. The lanterns flickered. Holmes's voice cut through the tension. "He knows we are here. We have been allowed to see this much because he has prepared the next act." Lestrade swore under his breath and gestured to the constables. "We take the bodies and the prisoner, and we get out, even if we have to blast our way through." Holmes stepped between him and the doorway. "No. If we move crudely, we may destroy evidence and alert him too soon. He may not flee. He may come to inspect his work." Watson felt a chill move through him. "Holmes, you mean he is near?" Holmes looked toward the shadows beyond the vault's entrance. "No, Watson. I mean he has been near for some time." As if in answer, a voice, smooth, measured, cultured, echoed from the far corridor. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes, I had hoped that you, of all men, would appreciate the artistry." The lamps trembled. The prisoner cried out in terror. Lestrade raised his pistol. Holmes stood very still. A figure emerged from the darkness, cloaked, composed, bearing no weapon visible save the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable. The curator. The figure stood with an ease that suggested he had not stumbled into darkness but rather belonged to it, as a creature might to its native habitat. His cloak, of dark cloth finely woven, hung without crease or stain, and though the lamplight reached him only imperfectly, it revealed a face neither remarkable nor forgettable, the very sort that might pass unnoticed at a train station or banking counter. His hair, meticulously groomed, bore no trace of dust from these subterranean passages, and his gloved hands rested lightly behind his back, as though he addressed visitors in a drawing room rather than intruders upon a hidden crypt. Holmes regarded him with the calm, appraising stillness that Watson had seen only in moments of the gravest stakes. Lestrade half raised his revolver, but Holmes extended an arm with such subtle authority that the inspector froze, the barrel lowering by inches. "You have gone to admirable lengths to avoid recognition," Holmes said quietly. "Yet your voice betrays a mind accustomed to command rather than obedience. You are not merely the designer of this place. You are the motive force behind it." The curator's lips curved, though whether in approval or amusement, Watson could not tell. "Names are tools, Mr. Holmes, and those who require them are often trapped by them. I have worn many, though none so fashionable as yours." Holmes inclined his head. "And the one you wear now?" "For the purposes of this conversation," the man replied, "you may continue to call me the curator. Names beyond that would burden you with knowledge you cannot safely carry." Watson felt Lestrade shift beside him, impatience rising. "You'll carry them at the yard soon enough. You're under arrest for murder, concealment of bodies, conspiracy to defraud, and half a dozen other charges I'll enjoy naming later." The curator regarded Lestrade with a polite calm that bordered on disdain. "Inspector, I commend your enthusiasm. It is refreshing to meet a man so convinced the law is a net rather than a sieve. But you did not come here by your own deduction. You were led." Lestrade colored, but Holmes spoke before he could answer. "You imply that we were invited into your labyrinth." The curator's eyes flickered toward the prisoner held by the constables. Not all invitations are issued willingly. Some are made through fear, others through necessity. This one, his gaze returned to Holmes, was made through curiosity. Yours. Watson sensed Holmes stiffen, though no change touched his countenance. Curiosity is often the first step toward uncovering truth. And sometimes, the curator replied, the first step toward destruction. Holmes remained impassive. This operation, whatever its full scope, cannot function in darkness forever. Murdered men do not stay silent indefinitely, however cleverly disguised. On the contrary, the curator said softly, silence is their only remaining virtue. They trouble no courts, unsettle no reputations, betray no secrets. They are perfect repositories of what is inconvenient to the living. Watson felt a wave of revulsion. You speak of human beings as if they were ledgers to be stored in a vault. Doctor, the curator replied evenly, the world you serve is held together by ledgers. The only difference is that mine cannot be audited. A tremor passed through the prisoner, who seemed unable to meet the curator's gaze. Holmes noted this, seizing upon it. This man claims Marot does not act alone, that he serves you. Is he your subordinate? The curator's smile thinned. Marot is an artist of flesh. Every age has its sculptor. Ancient Greece had Phidias. France had Houdon. Our age requires one suited to wax and preservation. I provide him the canvas. He provides me the form. Holmes took a step forward, his voice now edged with steel. And the dead? What purpose do they serve beyond macabre display? The curator's reply came not as rhetoric, but as simple fact. A dead man with no burial is a secret. A dead man standing among wax is a cipher. A dead man replaced in life by another is a weapon. Why trouble yourself with motives when the mechanism is so elegant? Watson felt a chill unlike any other he had known. Not horror at crime itself, but at the lucidity of a man who saw death not as tragedy, but raw material. Holmes spoke again, softly. Even the most intricate mechanism fails when one cog is removed, and you have misplaced at least two. The curator's expression changed for the first time, a faint tightening around the eyes, the smallest contraction of thought. Watson sensed a shift beneath the man's calm facade, not fear, but calculation. You speak, the curator said, as though you intend to remove me from the mechanism. Holmes's tone was almost mournful. You have mistaken me for the law. I intend to end the mechanism itself. For a heartbeat, the chamber felt utterly still. Then the curator exhaled, the faintest sigh, and stepped back toward the shadows. You have seen what you were permitted to see. The rest will remain beyond you. London has long been built on what lies beneath it: bones, debts, secrets. I merely continue the tradition with greater efficiency. Lestrade raised his pistol fully. You're not going anywhere. Move, and I'll fire. The curator stopped, though his posture did not betray alarm. I rarely move without purpose, Inspector. Today, my purpose is complete. He lifted one hand. Not in threat, but in signal. A low grinding sound began behind them. Holmes spun, lamp raised, just as one of the far passageways began to seal itself with descending stone, locking off the chamber. Another followed, and another, like a great mechanical throat closing around them. The constables shouted and ran to hold the blocks back, but the machinery was silent and relentless, driven not by gears but counterweights concealed in the walls. Watson turned back toward the curator, but he was no longer visible. Only the lingering echo of his steps remained, though even that faded into stillness. Holmes strode forward, lantern sweeping, searching for any trace of movement. But the chamber was empty save for the veiled bodies, the crates, and the men left behind. Lestrade cursed bitterly. He's gone, traps and passages everywhere, and we're penned like cattle. Holmes did not reply at once. He returned to the center of the chamber, his gaze passing from pedestal to pedestal, from corpse to corpse, from mask to mold. At last he spoke, not to Lestrade, but to Watson. "This is not the end." Watson nodded, though dread lingered. "No, but it is larger than we imagined." Holmes's voice lowered. "The curator thinks himself untouchable because he works in shadows and substitutes. He believes he can replace identities like garments and bury truth beneath wax. But every scheme, however intricate, rests upon one flaw. Its architect must remain somewhere, must breathe, must eat, must walk among the living, and a man who walks may be followed." Lestrade holstered his pistol reluctantly. "Then what now? We'll have these bodies removed. The yard will swarm this place." Holmes shook his head sharply. "No, not yet. If we move openly, he will abandon this warren, destroy what remains, and vanish into another mask. We must gather proof quietly, identify the living agents who benefit from these substitutions. We are not hunting a murderer, we are hunting a system." Watson sensed there was something unspoken behind Holmes's words, some deeper concern forming but not yet voiced. "You believe he has already replaced someone of importance?" Holmes met his gaze. "I believe he may have replaced several." A distant rumble vibrated through the stone as though something immense shifted far below them. Dust sifted from the ceiling. The lantern flames guttered. Lestrade stiffened. That wasn't machinery. Holmes listened with acute stillness. "That," he murmured, "was the river. The tunnels beneath us run close enough that at high tide the pressure strains the old foundations. If the curator wished to conceal traces, he could breach a wall and let the Thames wash away the evidence." Watson blanched. "Do you mean he intends to drown the chambers?" Holmes raised the lamp, eyes blazing with sudden clarity. "No, I mean he intends to drown us." As if in confirmation, a cold trickle of water seeped through a crack in the wall, thin at first, then widening into a steady stream. Lestrade shouted orders, the constables scrambling to brace the failing masonry. Watson seized the prisoner, hauling him back from the rising pool at his feet. Holmes moved to the center of the chamber, scanning the walls. "There must be an escape route not meant for corpses," he said. "Find the stones that have been touched most often, oiled hinges, hinges concealed." Watson pointed suddenly. There, on the third plinth, rust scraped away, not corrosion, fingernails. Holmes sprang toward it, pressed one hand to the corner stone and shifted his weight. A hidden panel clicked and swung inward. Cold air rushed through. A stair descended into deeper darkness, steep, narrow, glistening with damp. Holmes turned back to the others. The water was now ankle-deep. "Quickly, whatever lies below is our only path to the surface." Lestrade hesitated only long enough to shout to his men, then followed. Watson stepped through the opening. The stone door closed behind them with a final, echoing thud. And the chamber they left behind filled steadily, silently, with water. The stairway into which they descended was so narrow that only one man could pass at a time, forcing them into a single, wavering line down its slick stone spine. Holmes went first, his lamp held high, its weak flame trembling in the cold draught that rose from the depths. Watson followed close behind, mindful at every step that the stones were treacherous with moisture, while Lestrade and the constables brought up the rear, half dragging their terrified prisoner, whose trembling had grown so violent that Watson could hear his teeth chatter in the darkness. The lower they climbed, the louder grew a distant roar, not of machinery, nor of men, but of rushing water echoing through unseen caverns. The stair curved sharply, then straightened, then curved again, as though it wound around the bones of some vast creature slumbering beneath the earth. The temperature dropped further. Watson felt the cold seep through his coat into his very marrow. At last, the stair disgorged them into a long, vaulted corridor carved from older stone than anything above. Here, The air smelled of salt and riverweed, and the walls bore markings Watson had only seen in the crypts of ancient churches. The floor angled unevenly, and small rivulets of water trickled across their boots. Holmes did not pause. "This passage predates the museum by centuries," he said quietly. "It must have been part of the original foundations of the chapel. The curator has merely adapted what time and neglect provided." Lestrade grunted, shifting his weight uneasily as his boots splashed in a widening puddle. "Adapted it too well. If he means to drown us, he won't hesitate to let the place collapse." Holmes lifted the lamp higher, illuminating a distant archway. "He will not collapse the passage until he is certain we cannot escape. That is why we must be swift." Watson glanced over his shoulder. Far above them, faint but unmistakable, came the echoing crash of falling stone and the surge of water. The curator had indeed breached the chamber they had left behind. The Thames was swallowing it even now. Their only hope lay ahead. Holmes led them beneath the arch, into a cavernous space supported by thick, ancient pillars. The ceiling soared above like the nave of a forgotten cathedral, and somewhere high overhead water dripped in slow, rhythmic droplets. In the center of the chamber stood a strange construction, half scaffold, half dais, upon which lay bundles of canvas and crates that looked far too new for such surroundings. Holmes approached the nearest crate and brushed dust from its lid. "More wax models," he murmured, "and beneath them, paperwork, ledgers, correspondence." Lestrade stepped forward eagerly. "Evidence?" Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Possibly. But a man who constructs his secrets in wax does not leave his true records lying about. These may be decoys." Watson assisted in prying open one crate. Inside lay another wax figure, unfinished like the others, its face featureless, its limbs stiff and crude. But beneath the figure, wrapped in oilcloth, was a bundle of documents marked with the same inverted crown sigil. Holmes unfolded them swiftly. His eyes scanned the first page and hardened. "These are lists," he said. "Names, positions, dates of disappearance. Not all the names are familiar, but some are men of influence. And here, notes beside them. Duplicated, substituted, awaiting transfer." Watson felt a surge of dread. "Holmes, are you saying the curator has already replaced these men? That doubles walk London streets wearing their faces?" Holmes did not answer immediately. His silence spoke more clearly than any affirmation. The prisoner whimpered behind them. "He replaces those who hinder him, and those he needs, and those who know too much." Lestrade's jaw tightened. "We must take these records. They would sink him." Holmes shook his head. "If we leave carrying them, we become targets. He will not allow us to climb that stair again. No, these must remain hidden until we return with force enough to secure the entire labyrinth." A thunderous crack echoed through the chamber. Dust rained from the ceiling. The ground trembled. Watson looked upward in alarm. "Holmes, he is collapsing the tunnels." "Not yet," Holmes replied. "Not entirely. He wants us contained but not destroyed. Not while he has unfinished business." "Unfinished business," Watson repeated. Holmes looked toward the far side of the chamber, where another tunnel yawned like the throat of a beast. "He has not fled. A man like the curator does not run from pursuit. He rearranges pursuit. He writes its direction." Lestrade swore quietly. "If he is still here, he's madder than I thought." "Madness and reason often share chambers in the minds of men like him," Holmes said. "Come, there is more below." Watson felt cold dread rise within him. "Below?" "Holmes, the Thames must run beneath our feet." "Exactly," Holmes replied, "and the curator has relied on that very misconception to shield what he values most." With no alternative path, they followed Holmes toward the tunnel. It sloped downward, the air thickening with the scent of water and silt. Their lamps flickered violently now, though no breeze touched them. The tunnel opened into a wide circular space. A cistern, fed by channels from the river, but what stood at its center forced Watson to stop short. Platforms had been erected above the waterline, each bearing a completed wax figure, fully painted, exquisitely lifelike. They stood in silent formation, row upon row, as if awaiting deployment. Every face was different, yet eerily ordinary. Clerks, dock workers, policemen, shopkeepers, unidentifiable, interchangeable lives. It was as though a community of shadows waited for their opportunity to step into sunlight wearing borrowed identities. Watson felt his breath catch. Good God, he's creating an army of replacements. Holmes's voice was low, reverent in horror. Not soldiers, Watson. Instruments, faces to be worn, voices to be mimicked, lives to be imitated, each one ready to slip unnoticed into any corner of London. Lestrade stared, aghast. You mean an entire ring of impostors? How many? A voice answered from the darkness. As many as needed. The curator emerged once more, not from behind them, but from a narrow walkway above the cistern, his silhouette framed by shadow, his hands clasped behind his back like a lecturer addressing a class. Holmes stiffened. You remain, then? I remain, the curator replied calmly, to complete what must be completed. You see only threat where I see expansion, preservation, evolution. Watson stepped forward before he could stop himself. By murdering innocents and wearing their lives like costumes. The curator's eyes met his without a blink. All revolutions require sacrifice. Yours, Dr. Watson, are written in military records and lauded as noble. Mine will be written in a language you are not equipped to understand. Holmes's voice cut through the chamber. You cannot escape now. The water rises behind us. Your passages collapse. Your mechanism turns upon itself. You have trapped yourself with us. The curator smiled. No, Mr. Holmes. I have trapped you with me. The platform beneath his feet shifted. A section of walkway descended, carrying him toward a narrow fissure at the cistern's far wall. He stepped into it, the stone pivoting behind him like the lid of a tomb. Holmes lunged forward, but it was too late. The curator had vanished into darkness. Water surged suddenly from the channels below, rising at an alarming pace. The wax figures trembled upon their platforms. Holmes turned sharply. Watson, Lestrade, this chamber will flood within minutes. There must be an outlet, an access tunnel for drainage or maintenance. Look for what does not belong. Metal amid stone, new amid ancient. Watson swept the lantern beam across the curved walls. The surface glistened with moisture, but one area, low on the right, shimmered differently as though polished by more than water. Holmes, he called. Here. Holmes hurried to his side, knelt, and pressed his palm against the stone. Not stone, he murmured. Iron coated in plaster. He struck it with the butt of his cane. A hollow sound answered. Lestrade shouted, Stand back! He and the constables threw their weight against it. The metal groaned, then shifted. At last, it swung inward, revealing a narrow passage slanting upward. Holmes seized Watson by the arm. Go, now! The water clawed at their boots as they climbed. The roar behind them grew into a thunderous voice, as though the river itself bellowed in pursuit. The lamps bobbed frantically, their light barely steady enough to keep the way visible. Upward, the passage wound, steep, twisting, irregular. Watson's breath grew ragged. Holmes ascended with relentless precision, his silhouette a dark spear cutting through the choking dark. Lestrade's voice echoed with curses, commands, the scrape of boots. At last, after what felt like an eternity, the passage narrowed, then widened, then ended beneath a heavy grate. Above the grate, faint light gleamed. Holmes braced his back, pushed. It did not budge. Watson pushed alongside him. Still nothing. Lestrade joined them, muscles straining. The grate shuddered. Holmes's voice rose with fierce urgency. Once more, together, now! They pushed. The grate burst upward, clattering onto pavement. Holmes hauled himself through. Watson followed. Lestrade next. They spilled onto a narrow alley behind a row of warehouses, the early dawn grey and merciless above them. Water gushed from the grate like a broken artery, flooding the alley. Holmes stood, breathless but composed. Watson rose beside him, trembling. Lestrade staggered upright, soaked to the bone, and behind them, far below, the underground labyrinth drowned beneath the rising Thames, burying its dead, its secrets, and its architect's designs beneath black water. Holmes gazed toward the river. "He is not dead," he said quietly. "He has simply changed masks." Watson swallowed hard. "Then the case is not over." "No," Holmes replied. "Chapters remain." The dawn that greeted them felt less like morning and more like an admonition. Its pale, indifferent light revealed every dripping coat, every streak of river silt upon their garments, every shadow beneath their eyes. Steam rose from their shoulders like ghosts fleeing the body. Holmes stood in the narrow alley beside the grate, his features sharpened by the cold air, his hair plastered to his forehead. Yet his eyes, far from dulled by exhaustion, seemed charged with a keener fire than before. Watson leaned against the damp brick wall, breath trembling as he steadied himself. Lestrade wrung out his sleeve with a motion that betrayed both irritation and relief, muttering under his breath about madmen building cities beneath cities. The constables looked shaken, their confidence battered by the impossibility of what they had witnessed below. Passages that shifted, chambers that filled with water, a phantom adversary who treated pursuit as theatre. Holmes surveyed the alley with a long, calculating look before speaking. "We must not linger here. The curator has eyes in places where one would expect only shadows. If he knows where we emerged, he may send his agents to intercept us." Lestrade straightened at once. "We'll return to the yard. I'll send men to every exit around the river tunnels. If he tries to surface—" Holmes cut him off with a measured shake of the head. "You misunderstand him. A man who constructs a labyrinth beneath a public museum and commands men by fear does not flee upward where constables may see him. He will disappear into a new stratum of the city, one you have not yet charted." Lestrade scowled, though less from disagreement than the frustration of being outpaced. "Then what do you suggest?" Holmes turned toward Watson. "We return to Baker Street. There is much to analyze. Traces from the bodies, the clay upon their boots, the paper remnants, the sigils. Each thread may be followed, but only when dry and in solitude." "And the bodies?" Lestrade asked. Holmes paused. "When the river has done its work, the chambers may be drained, though it may be days before they are safe to enter. For now, secure the surface entrances and prevent scavengers or curious trespassers from approaching. But do not, under any circumstances, alert the press. If the curator suspects we are publicizing his methods, he will accelerate whatever he intends next." Lestrade nodded grimly. "I'll see to it. Holmes, Watson, take care. If we truly face a man who treats identity as clay, London may already be crawling with his work." Holmes's mouth tightened, which is precisely why silence, for now, is our strongest ally. A hansom was summoned, though the driver eyed them with a mixture of suspicion and pity, thinking perhaps they had suffered some accident near the river. Holmes gave the address in a clipped tone, and soon they were rattling through the grey morning streets, water dripping from their coats, leaving a faint trail upon the cab's floor. Watson, exhausted though he was, found no peace in the steady rhythm of hooves. His mind replayed the subterranean horrors, the chamber of corpses, the silent wax figures waiting like an army at attention, the curator's voice echoing from the darkness. Even more unsettling was the knowledge that the man had escaped, his designs not thwarted but merely postponed. Holmes sat opposite him, pipe neglected in his fingers, gaze fixed upon some point far beyond the cab window. Watson recognized that look well. It meant that Holmes's mind was assembling the fragments of the night's discoveries into a shape visible only to him. At last, Watson broke the silence. "Holmes, you said that the curator had replaced men already. Do you truly believe that living doubles walk the streets?" Holmes did not shift his gaze. "Not merely living doubles. Living tools. Imagine, Watson, a man whose face is replicated in wax, whose mannerisms are studied by those trained in mimicry, whose voice might be imitated with sufficient practice. A man who vanishes quietly, replaced by another who performs his habits well enough that no one questions the substitution." Watson felt a chill. But such a plan would unravel under scrutiny. A wife, a child, a colleague, they would know. Holmes looked at him then, sharply. Would they? If the double interacts only where necessary, correspondence, signatures, brief encounters, and avoids intimacy. If the real man is kept alive until no inquiry remains, or if he is never missed because the double never intrudes upon private life. Think, Watson. The curator's genius lies not in creating perfect replicas, but in creating replicas only where imperfection will not be noticed. Watson nodded slowly, dread returning. Clerks, messengers, policemen, men whose duties require routine, not close fellowship. Precisely, Holmes said. Substitutions that oil the machinery of a larger scheme. The curator does not replace men for sport. He replaces them to shape operations that depend upon silence, anonymity, and invisibility. The cab jolted as it turned sharply onto Baker Street. Holmes fell silent, returning to the theater of his thoughts. At last, they arrived. Mrs. Hudson, upon opening the door and taking in their bedraggled state, let out a soft cry of alarm, but Holmes waved her off before she could voice her concerns. "Warm water and strong tea," he murmured. "Then you may ask what calamity has followed us home." They warmed themselves by the fire, steam rising from their soaked garments. Watson felt life return to his chilled limbs, though Holmes seemed more concerned with examining each item taken from the chamber than with drying himself. He spread the documents upon the table, lit his pipe, and inhaled deeply before beginning. "Carraway," Holmes said, "a confidential clerk, entrusted with financial records, summoned to that subterranean lair with orders to bring his firm's documents, and now displayed among the waxworks. He is a victim, not a collaborator." Watson nodded. And the other, the one preserved earlier, was likely another such pawn. Holmes's pipe smoke curled in thin spirals as he nodded. "Yes. The first corpse we found had the stiffness of a man recently deceased, but not so recently as Carraway. He may have resisted, or discovered something earlier, or served a different purpose as the curator's methods evolved." Watson examined one page bearing the inverted crown sigil. "These symbols, are they a cipher?" Holmes leaned closer. "Not precisely. More a ledger of intention. Each symbol corresponds to a stage of the curator's work. Duplicated means the figure has been completed. Substituted suggests a living double has already stepped into the victim's role. Awaiting transfer. That one chills me most. It implies movement, coordination, a network." A faint knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Hudson appeared, pale. "A young man to see you, Mr. Holmes. He insists it is urgent." Holmes frowned. "Send him up." Moments later, a thin clerk entered the room, wet-haired from fog, eyes hollow with something between fear and desperation. He clutched a parcel wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Holmes?" the young man asked, voice shaking. Were you expecting this?" "It was left at the office where I work. Addressed to you. No sender." Holmes took the parcel and dismissed the clerk with a nod, his expression grave. Watson felt apprehension coil in his gut. "Holmes, be cautious." Holmes examined the parcel. No handwriting save his name in a neat, almost mechanical script. No wax seal, no return address, only twine and brown paper. He cut the string, unwrapped the paper, then froze. Inside was a wax mask, and not just any mask. Watson recoiled with a cry of horror. It was Holmes's face, perfectly sculpted, perfectly shaded, cooled as though recently cast, the lips slightly parted, the brow composed in that familiar expression of concentrated calm. Holmes held it up by its edges, examining it with chilling self-control. His eyes, though steady, darkened as though seeing in these features not likeness, but threat. Watson whispered, "Holmes, he means to replace you." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Not replace. Warn." "A warning," Watson breathed. Holmes nodded. "He sends this not as an attack, but as an invitation, a declaration. The curator has set his eyes upon me as a subject worthy of duplication or destruction." Watson felt blood drain from his face. "Holmes, he means to draw you deeper." Holmes set the mask down gently, as though laying aside a fallen soldier. His voice, when it came, was quiet but resolute. "Then deeper we shall go, Watson." Below street level, far beneath the city's waking pulse, a plan stirred like a creature roused from its slumber. And Holmes, now marked by the curator's interest, had become part of its design. For some little time after the delivery of the waxen likeness, the atmosphere of our sitting room at Baker Street seemed altered in a fashion that I find difficult to describe. It was not merely that the mask of my friend's own face lay upon the table between us, like a fallen moon, pale and expressionless. It was as though the room itself had become a theatre in which two minds, Holmes's and that of the unseen curator, confronted one another by proxy. The familiar objects, the worn armchair, the chemical table, the violin upon its shelf, appeared to recede into the background, their homely contours blurred by the presence of that singular object which now commanded our attention. Holmes had taken to pacing, a habit he indulged only when a case touched him more nearly than he cared to admit. His long strides carried him from fire to window and back again, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze rarely wavering from the mask. The likeness was so faithful that, once caught, the eye could scarcely resist returning to it. The aquiline nose, the fine-cut lips, the angular planes of cheek and brow, all captured with an artistry that spoke not only of technical skill, but of prolonged observation. "You see, Watson," Holmes said at last, his voice measured, "this is not merely a threat, it is a confession. Our adversary admits not only that he has studied me, but that he believes his art sufficient to reproduce me." Watson suppressed a shiver. "I do not care to imagine a London in which a man wearing your face moves among the unsuspecting." Holmes's lips curved faintly. "Nor do I. But the true danger lies not in one false Holmes, but in the principle of substitution itself. If he can fashion my likeness, there is no barrier of station or intelligence beyond his reach. It is a declaration of capability, not yet of intent." "Not yet?" I repeated. Holmes halted before the table, his gaze sharpening. "The curator is not a common assassin. He does not strike without calculation. To remove me from the board would be a gesture, but not a strategic one, unless he had already secured all the pieces I might otherwise defend. I do not believe his design is complete. This mask is his way of saying, 'You have entered my gallery, Mr. Holmes. I've placed you among my exhibits. Let us see which of us first alters the other.' At the risk of sounding self-regarding, I ventured, I should prefer that you not become one of his exhibits in any fashion." Holmes's eyes softened for a moment, and he laid a hand upon my shoulder. "Your concern does you honor, my dear fellow. Yet it is precisely because he has chosen to engage me that we gain an advantage. A man who reveals his fascination also reveals his weaknesses. Vanity is among the most destructive." There was a rap at the door, sharp and brisk. Mrs. Hudson announced Inspector Lestrade, whose entry was marked by an air of tension more pronounced even than usual. His face was pale beneath the gaslight, and there were faint shadows under his eyes that suggested he too had found little rest. "Holmes," he began without preamble, "we may have the beginning of an answer, or another complication. It depends upon your view." "Pray enlighten us," Holmes said, resuming his seat and gesturing toward a chair. The mask lay between them like a silent third interlocutor. Lestrade sat, but on the edge of the chair, as though unwilling to commit his full weight to the relative comfort of Baker Street. "We've had word from the city. Mr. Vale, you remember, the head of Hargreaves, Wilson and Vale, came to the yard in some distress. It seems certain transactions undertaken by his firm over the past months bear traces of forgery. Signatures that are his, yet not." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Not his." "So he claims," Lestrade said. "Payments authorized in his hand for shipments that never arrived, to clients he's never met. Yet the records show his approval in black and white. He swears on his family's honor that he never wrote those orders." Holmes steepled his fingers. "And does he recall where he was at the time? The documents were signed." Lestrade shifted slightly. "That's the curious part. On each of those days, he says, he received visitors, men who called upon him to discuss matters of business, who knew details only his closer associates would possess. The meetings were brief and nothing came of them directly, but the forged signatures appeared within weeks of each encounter. He's only noticed the pattern now that suspicion has been aroused." Holmes's expression grew thoughtful. "Visitors who knew enough to pass muster, yet did not linger long enough to invite familiarity. And these transactions, where did the funds go? To a series of shell companies and foreign accounts that vanish into smoke when traced," Lestrade replied. "Or so my men tell me. I confess that the subtleties of international finance are not my forte." Holmes's gaze flicked toward the wax mask upon the table. The curator has been testing his methods not only upon clerks and watchmen, but upon men of commerce. If he can duplicate a signature and presence sufficiently to authorize financial maneuvers, he can siphon wealth from institutions with the world none the wiser. Lestrade's mouth tightened. "Then this is not merely some grotesque hobby. It is a scheme to rob half the city." "Not rob," Holmes corrected quietly. "Redistribute, direct, purchase influence. A thief steals and flees. A man like the curator dresses his theft as legitimate transaction and uses its proceeds to build structures others will not see until they stand beneath them." Watson could not help exclaiming, "But surely, Holmes, once this is known, precautions may be taken. Additional witnesses at signings, locks upon certain accounts, verification by telegraph." Holmes shook his head. "Measures may be taken, yes, and will be once the danger is public. But we do not yet know how many signatures have already been imitated, how many men replaced, how many transactions executed. To sound the alarm prematurely would be to drive him into deeper burrows, perhaps leaving behind doubles who would continue his work in his absence. No, we require something more." Lestrade frowned. "And what might that be?" "A living link," Holmes replied. "A man who moves between the curator's underworld and the surface, who can be induced to speak, not from fear of the law, but from fear of the curator himself. I was reminded of the prisoner in the tunnels, the trembling creature whose terror had been as palpable as the clammy stones about us." "The man we apprehended below," I said. "What became of him, Lestrade?" Lestrade shifted, his expression grim. "We brought him to the yard. He refused to give his name, called himself only a porter, rambled about faces and ghosts, about debts owed to men whose names he dared not speak. Before we could draw anything coherent from him, he attempted to throw himself down a flight of stairs. We stopped him in our time, but he's in a sorry state, wild-eyed, half delirious. The surgeon says the man is more frightened than mad, though the line between the two is thin just now." Holmes rose abruptly. "We must see him at once." Lestrade blinked. "You think you can succeed where we failed?" Holmes's voice was level. Your questions, my dear Lestrade, are framed by the law, mine are framed by necessity. A terrified man will not respond to threats, but he may respond to something worse. Worse? I echoed involuntarily. Holmes turned to me, his gaze grave. The truth. An hour later, we were seated in a small bare room at the yard, where the prisoner lay upon a narrow cot, his wrists loosely bound to prevent further self-injury. His eyes, hollow and rimmed with red, flickered ceaselessly between ceiling and door. At the sound of our entry, he flinched, pressing himself against the wall as though seeking to vanish into stone. Holmes dismissed the warder with a brief gesture and took the lone chair, positioning it at a slight angle to the cot. He did not sit immediately, but stood, regarding the man in silence until the prisoner's restless gaze settled upon his. "You remember me," Holmes said at last, his tone neither gentle nor harsh. The man nodded once, a jerky motion. "You called him the curator," Holmes continued. "You spoke of masks, of faces, of men replaced. The inspector here wishes you to tell us names and dates. I wish something different." The man's lips parted. "He'll know. He always knows. Even down there he knew when you breathed, when you stepped, when you looked upon what wasn't meant for you." Holmes inclined his head. "No doubt, but hear me. The chambers you fled are now filling with water. The pedestals are drowning. The dead are, for this moment, beyond his use. His attention will turn elsewhere, to those above, to any survivor who might betray him." The prisoner shut his eyes tightly, as though to block out the image. Holmes's voice dropped. "You fear him because you believe he is omnipotent. That is precisely what he wishes. But he is only a man. I have seen his limitations. I have watched his mechanism falter when confronted with variables he did not predict." Lestrade shot me a quick glance. He knew as well as I that Holmes's words were not for our benefit, but for the mind trembling upon the edge of collapse. The man opened his eyes again, a faint spark of something, anger perhaps, glimmering beneath the terror. "You don't know him. He can wear anyone, be anyone. You think you saw him, but that may not have been him at all. He could be sitting in this room now, in your face, in mine, in his." He jerked his chin toward Lestrade. Holmes shook his head. "No. For all his skill, he cannot be everywhere at once, and he cannot be in this room because I can see the fear in you, and fear is the one thing he cannot fully disguise. It leaks, it betrays, and it has begun to betray him through you." The man stared, his breath quickening. "You were a porter," Holmes went on, his tone now more gentle. "You carried crates, bodies, perhaps even messages. You knew the tunnels, you knew when men went down and did not return, but you also know something more, something that made him fear you enough to trap you with us below, rather than let you roam free." A tremor passed through the man. He said, "I'd seen too much." "What did you see?" Holmes asked quietly. The man swallowed. His gaze flicked to Lestrade, then back to Holmes. He wore another man, put on his manner, his words like clothing. I thought he'd given the sculptor his face, but it wasn't that. It was the way he spoke to the others, like he'd been that man for years. Holmes leaned forward. "What man?" The prisoner's voice dropped to a whisper. "A gentleman. Came down once with a lantern. Fine coat, fine shoes, fine way of talking. Spoke of museums, of patrons, of exhibitions." The curator bowed to him, called him by name. Said he'd secure more funds, more protection. "And the name?" Holmes pressed, his own voice barely audible. The man stared at him, eyes wide. "Varenne." My heart leapt. "Madame Varenne." The prisoner nodded violently. No, a man, her brother, her patron, her partner. I don't know, but Varenne. I heard it, clear as a bell. And then I saw that man again. Weeks later, different coat, same voice. Only this time he walked among the waxworks upstairs, talking to the gentry, laughing, and the curator walked behind him like his shadow. Holmes's face had hardened to marble. "You are certain?" "I swear it," the man whispered. "If I lie, may I never leave this room alive." Holmes straightened slowly. "You may yet leave it, and safely, if you tell the inspector everything you can recall of these meetings. Dates, phrases, other names. But understand this. The curator is no longer confined to tunnels. He moves among drawing rooms and galleries under a name the city respects." He turned to Lestrade. "You see now, Inspector, the Wax Museum was not merely a hiding place. It was an antechamber to higher society, and the curator's hand may reach into circles where Madame Varenne's name opens doors." Lestrade's eyes flashed. "You think Madame is involved?" Holmes shook his head. "I think she is a doorway, not yet aware that someone has walked through her into rooms where she herself has not stood. We must tread carefully. When men of standing become suspects, scandal shadows every step." As we left the cell, the prisoner's last whispered words followed us like a draught from the grave. "He'll make you one of them," he murmured. "He's already begun." Holmes did not reply, but I saw, as we emerged once more into the lamplit corridor of the yard, that his profile wore a new tension, the look of a man who has discovered that his quarry has not only burrowed underground, but risen above him into realms where law and reputation intertwine. The curator had taken a new shape, and we would have to follow him into it. The fog had begun to creep in from the river by the time Holmes and I returned to Baker Street that evening, curling along the street like a restless animal seeking entry. The lamps cast long, wavering halos upon the pavement, and the clatter of distant hansoms sounded strangely muffled, as though the city itself sensed the shadow that now lay over it. For my own part, I felt a heaviness that had nothing to do with fatigue of the body. It was the oppression that comes when one realizes that the foe one hunts does not merely hide in dark places, but moves freely in the very light where one walks, cloaked not by darkness, but by recognition. Holmes entered our sitting room with that same air of remote intensity he always bore in the late stages of a case. But there was something else now, an alertness so keen it bordered upon ferocity. He threw off his coat and set the wax mask of his own likeness upon the mantelpiece, where its pale features caught the firelight, and seemed to regard us with a silent challenge. "Watson," he said, pacing before the hearth, "we have been deceived not by the curator's cunning, but by his audacity. While we pursued him below, he has walked above. While we tracked his tunnels, he has attended exhibitions, dined in parlors, spoken with citizens who took him for another man entirely. You believe the man the prisoner saw, this Varenne, was himself a facade." Holmes stopped pacing. Not merely a facade, a role, an identity worn as easily as a cloak. His gaze shifted to the mask. If he could fashion my likeness with such skill, imagine how he might imitate others, men of standing, men whose faces are familiar only to a select circle. I shuddered. "But Madame Varenne, she cannot be part of this." "She may not be," Holmes replied, "but her name is the key he required. The brother of a celebrated curator, or a cousin of influence, or an imagined relation introduced at the right moment. Society rarely questions what appears already familiar. The curator has inserted himself into her orbit through a relationship that may be entirely fabricated." Before I could answer, a soft knock sounded below. Mrs. Hudson's voice rose through the stairwell. "Mr. Holmes, sir, a lady to see you, most agitated." Holmes exchanged a quick glance with me. "Madame Varenne," he murmured. And indeed, a moment later, she swept into the room, her cheeks pale, her gloved hands trembling. She wore no bonnet, as though she had left her home in haste. Her eyes moved quickly between us, then fixed upon the wax mask upon the mantel. At the sight of it, she let out a soft cry and clutched at the back of the nearest chair. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered, "what have you discovered? Why was I summoned to the yard only to be told nothing? Why did they hint that my name was spoken by a criminal? You must tell me what horror touches my family." Holmes motioned her to sit. "Madame, there is much we cannot yet prove, but I can tell you this. Your name has been used, without your knowledge, to facilitate activities which go beyond ordinary criminal enterprise." "My name?" she repeated faintly. "But who? Who could do such a thing?" "Hear me carefully," Holmes said. "Have you any brother, cousin, or relative bearing your surname who might have dealings with the museum? Someone who could pass convincingly as part of your family circle?" She shook her head vehemently. "No, none. I am without siblings. My cousins live in the countryside and have no interest in my work. I've introduced no man to the museum as family, save my late husband, God rest his soul, and he has been gone these 3 years." Holmes inhaled sharply, as though a long-sought piece had at last fallen into its rightful place. "Then the curator has assumed a family connection that does not exist," he said. "He has presented himself to patrons and dignitaries as a Varenne, your brother perhaps, to gain influence within the artistic and financial circles to which you have access." Madame Varenne pressed a trembling hand to her mouth. "No. No, Mr. Holmes, surely no one could." "Madame," Holmes interrupted gently yet firmly, "you yourself stood beside a man at your gala who claimed kinship with you." She stared at him, stricken. "Mr. Holmes, I greeted many that evening. Faces blur under the gaslight, but I recall no one who claimed to be my brother." Holmes stepped closer. He would not have declared it openly, but he would have let others assume it. Introductions engineered, conversations guided, a resemblance suggested. "I should have known," she burst out. "There was a man, tall, well-spoken, elegantly dressed, who moved among the donors with remarkable ease. Several guests whispered his name, thinking him connected to me, and I dismissed the gossip as nonsense. When I spoke to him myself, he was courteous, refined, almost deferential. He said only that he admired my late husband's vision and wished to see the museum thrive." Holmes exchanged a grave look with me. When men hide in plain sight, they do so by adopting the guise that invites least scrutiny. Madame Varenne rose abruptly. "Mr. Holmes, you must stop him. Whatever he intends, it must end. My museum, my staff, my life, he has infiltrated all of it." Holmes's expression softened, though it bore no comfort. "I intend to, madame. But to do so, we must confront him not below ground, where he commands the terrain, but above, where he believes himself beyond suspicion." "How?" she whispered. Holmes turned to the window, where the fog pressed like a veiled face against the pane. "By forcing him into a place where masks offer no protection. Gathering where every eye watches closely, where he cannot control the flow of events. A public setting where his role as Varenne is expected, and where deviation will condemn him." Madame Varenne gasped softly. "Mr. Holmes, tomorrow evening there is to be a private showing at Lord Ashcombe's gallery. New acquisitions from the continent. The sponsors include several patrons who attended my gala. The man you speak of would almost certainly appear there." Holmes turned, his gaze bright with purpose. "Then that is where we shall corner him." The next evening found us at Lord Ashcombe's gallery, an elegant building bathed in warm lamplight, its exterior bustling with carriages and fashionable visitors. Holmes, dressed with particular care and wearing an expression of serene detachment, moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who has worn such gatherings as armor. I followed, keenly aware of the tension that pulsed beneath the evening's polished veneer. The gallery's interior shimmered with rich fabrics, gilded frames, and the low murmur of genteel conversation. Yet Holmes's posture stiffened almost at once. His eyes flicked from figure to figure, studying gestures, mannerisms, the tilt of a head, the fall of a coat. Then he stopped. A man stood before a newly unveiled portrait, tall, impeccably dressed, with dark hair brushed back from a high brow. He held a glass of wine lightly, speaking to a group of admirers with an ease that bespoke long familiarity. And though I had never seen him before, something in the angle of his jaw, the precise, calculated grace of his movement, struck me with sudden recognition. Holmes whispered, "That is the man who posed as Varenne." Madame Varenne, standing beside us, turned pale. "I know him. He spoke with me that night, but I have never seen him elsewhere." Holmes's voice dropped to a murmur. "He's wearing a face, one crafted from truth and invention, but he is not invulnerable." As if sensing our scrutiny, the man glanced toward us. His eyes met Holmes's, and in that instant something passed between them, an acknowledgement, dark and electric, like two duelists measuring the distance before raising pistols. The man smiled faintly. Then he excused himself from his companions and walked with unhurried grace toward the far exit. Holmes moved instantly. "Watson, after him." We cut through the throng, sending murmurs rippling across the gallery. Lestrade, who had stationed himself near the entrance at Holmes's request, saw us move and fell in behind. The curator, if indeed this was he, slipped into a side corridor lined with smaller canvases, weaving through the dim light as though the shadows welcomed him. Holmes quickened his pace. We must not lose sight of him, not even for a moment. But the corridor bent sharply, and for a single breath he vanished from view. We rounded the corner and froze. The corridor was empty. No footsteps. No door ajar. No trailing shadow. Only a single object lay on the floor, a wax mask. But this one was different. It bore not Holmes's face. It bore the face of the very man we had pursued. Holmes knelt, lifting it. The mask was still warm. Watson found his voice first. "He has shed this identity already." Holmes rose slowly, and taken up another as easily as one might don a coat. "He has walked past us perhaps a dozen times tonight, wearing a face we did not think to question." Lestrade swore softly. "Then he's escaped again." Holmes shook his head. "No, not escaped, transformed, and somewhere in this gallery, perhaps even now, he stands among us, listening to every word." The fog thickened outside. The lamps flickered. Holmes's eyes narrowed with terrible clarity. "The curator is not one man, not any more. He is any man he chooses, and until we unmask not his disguises but his purpose, he will always be one face ahead." He turned toward the crowd beyond the door, the sea of indistinguishable silhouettes. "Our hunt," he said quietly, "has only just begun." And so ended the case of the Wax Museum, for the moment. But as Holmes would later remark, the true mystery lay not beneath the city, but within it, wearing 1,000 faces that even he had yet to recognize.